Hi, everyone. Today we're talking about the topics of bullshit and unreasonable doubt. In particular, we're taking a look at a little book by Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit and a short article by Oreskes and Conway called Defeating the Merchants of Doubt. So you'll see that they have some similar themes and cover some of the same ground, but also pick up on some very different trajectories that untruth might have. So I want to start with this quote from Nietzsche. So he says, "Suppose we want truth. Why not rather untruth and uncertainty, even ignorance?" Now, at first, this might sound like a set of very stupid questions, right? You might think, well, of course, I'd rather know something versus being ignorant. I'd rather have certainty. The truth is better than the untruth, and so on. But once we start thinking about it, you might notice that the answer to Nietzsche's question is maybe not as obvious as it might seem at first. So, as it happens, human beings often do prefer untruth to truth in various different contexts that we'll talk about. So, important points from today. So, the concept of bullshit from Frankfurt and how it's different from lying. The notion of doubt mongering or creating unreasonable doubt in the minds of people. That comes from Oreskes and Conway. We'll cover their notion of selling doubt to people, and we'll talk about the difference between reasonable and unreasonable doubt. And finally, we'll end with the discussion of the value of truth, right? So, trying to address Nietzsche's question, why, if at all, should we value the truth? So just to begin with, falsehood comes in various different varieties. So one major distinction is between simply having a mistaken belief versus a lie. So if I believe something and I honestly think it's true, but I'm wrong, you might say, well, I have this false belief in my mind, but I'm not trying to deceive anyone. I just honestly believe something that turns out not to be correct. So, for example, an easy one is a child who is confused about basic multiplication and thinks 2 times 3 equals 8. Right? They think that, and then over time, hopefully, they correct that and come to see why that was a mistake. But if they go around saying that, they write that down on their test in third grade or whatever it is, they're not trying to fool their teacher into believing this. They just honestly think that 2 times 3 equals 8. Contrast that with a lie. So imagine this, that in that same situation, it's the teacher who tells the children that 2 times 3 equals 8. And the teacher knows that this is a false claim, but for whatever weird reason, they want to deceive these poor kids, and they therefore teach them this falsehood. So in both cases, we have the same false claim, 2 times 3 equals 8, but it's used in very different ways in those two cases. And that's going to be important for some reasons that we'll see momentarily. So let's spell out what the difference really is between lying and honestly believing something that's false. So the difference between a lie and a mistaken belief. So the liar is attempting to get someone to believe a claim that the liar takes to be false. There has to be some sort of intent to deceive on the part of the liar. They may succeed or they may not. Right? Some people are bad at telling lies, and it's obvious what they're doing, but they still have the intent to deceive. By contrast, the mistaken believer simply is incorrect in thinking that a certain false claim is true. So they have no intent to deceive. That false belief could be the result of many things, right? So poor education, they made a mistake in their reasoning, the evidence seemed to support something, but it turns out that that was misleading. Perhaps they've fallen victim to lies from unscrupulous actors, various things like that. So we encounter this all the time in our lives, this difference. Falsehood is present in both cases, but it has a different use or is used in different ways in lying versus honest mistaken belief. So with this in mind, let's address what Frankfurt has to say about bullshit. So the concept of bullshit to him is a distinct domain of falsehood. And as he defines it, he says that bullshit is something that involves fakery or phoniness. An interesting claim that he makes is that the bullshitter, the person who engages in the practice of peddling bullshit, is not necessarily making false claims. They probably will be often, but as we're going to see, they don't care either way whether what they say is false or true. The important point, according to Frankfurt, is that the bullshitter fakes things. So the bullshitter is pretending to be something or to know something that he or she doesn't actually know or actually is not. It could happen just by chance that some of the things that they say are true. That's fine. As we're going to see, that's very different from the liar who wants to go out of their way to make sure that the person that they're lying to doesn't believe what the liar thinks the truth is. So as Frankfurt puts it, the bullshitter misrepresents himself or what he or she is up to. So as I said before, the bullshitter pretends to be something that they're not. So they might try to pass themselves off as an expert when in fact they know nothing about the topic at hand. Now, some people are very good at this. Some people are very bad at it. We've all probably experienced this. Maybe in some cases we're not quite sure. We suspect that somebody is bullshitting, but we can't prove it. But I suppose and assume that many of us are going to be familiar with this phenomenon. So let's talk about some examples of bullshit. So the domain of academia provides many examples of this. So imagine an associate dean, right, who works at the university, who issues the following announcement. So they say, "I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to announce the hiring of our new senior assistant to the vice president of student-centered initiatives. I am confident that he will make excellent contributions to our value-added ventures in this exciting new space." So we're all familiar with this, right? That people in professional positions of some sort of petty power often say things like this. We don't take it that seriously, but it's come to be expected. Why does this count as bullshit on Frankfurt's understanding? Well, the main reason is that the dean would issue a statement like this, regardless of whether it's true or not. Right? No matter who they hire, it's expected and basically required for their position that they talk like this. Suppose that the person that they hired was their last choice. All the good candidates turned them down. They had no choice but to go with this really mediocre candidate. The associate dean would, in most cases, still issue a statement like this and pretend that this person is really great and that the dean believes that this person is really great. The point of this is that the announcement aims to paint a certain kind of picture. It tries to represent things in a certain way. For example, that we have everything under control here, we're hiring the best people, don't worry, we're competent, and things like that. But given that the dean would say this, regardless of whether it's true or not, means that it counts as an example of bullshit. Importantly, as we're going to see here in a second, the associate dean does not care about the truth in this case. They're just saying what they think that they're supposed to say in order to represent themselves and the institution in a certain light. Now, remember, the claim here could be true. Maybe the person that they hired really is an amazing fit for the position, and the associate dean really is excited, and this isn't fake. It's possible that that could be the case sometimes. I suspect it's often not, but it could be on occasion. Again, it still counts as bullshit, even if it happens to be true in some cases, if and because the associate dean would say this regardless of what the facts were. So some other examples. Imagine the student who tries to fake her way through writing a philosophy paper. Right? So they didn't study at all, they didn't do the reading, they didn't come to class. Now this paper is due, and they get the brilliant idea that, like, well, I'm just going to pretend that I know what I'm talking about. I'm going to say all of these things that sound really smart. I'm going to use all of these words and these concepts. And the goal is, it often won't work, right? But the goal is to try and represent to the person grading the paper that the student knows what they're talking about, that they understand the material, and that they can represent themselves as somebody who knows whatever the area of philosophy is that they're writing on. The point is that the person who writes this paper, they don't care whether what they're saying is accurate or not. They just want to pull the wool over the eyes of the grader and make it seem like they know what they're doing. Or imagine an ignorant politician who pretends to be an expert on economic policy, right? They go on CNN or something and they say all of these things and they sound confident, but in reality they don't know the first thing about economics. They're just reading off the talking points that they were given by people higher up in their political party or whatever it may be. Or imagine the salesperson, right, whose goal is to get you to buy their product, and they're going to say whatever they think will actually get you to buy that product. So whether it's true, whether it's false, whether it's an accurate representation of what the salesperson actually knows or believes, if they don't care about any of that and they're just going to say whatever they think it will take to get you to buy the thing, then that's an example of bullshitting. So again, I think we're all familiar with this kind of thing, but Frankfurt's goal is to try and at least begin to give some conceptual clarification to this phenomenon so that we can pick it out more easily, recognize it, and for him, importantly, distinguish it from lying. So let's talk about that directly. So why is bullshitting different from lying? Well, according to Frankfurt, the bullshitter may say a lot of false things, but their goal is never to deceive others into believing some specific false claim. Right, so the bullshitter is just trying to represent themselves as somebody who, say, knows something that they don't. And it's not so much that they want, take the example of the politician again, it's not so much that they want their listeners to believe some particular false claim about economics. Rather, they just want to represent themselves as somebody who knows about economics. They just want to look good. They want to present themselves in a certain light. So they'll say whatever they think will help them achieve that goal. It's often going to involve saying false things, but sometimes it might involve saying true things. The important point is that the bullshitter is misrepresenting him or herself, right? Back to Frankfurt's point, that's a kind of phoniness or fakeness, different from lying about a specific claim. In general, the bullshitter simply doesn't care about the truth, whereas the liar does care about the truth, and in many ways, very, very deeply. So we'll talk about that in a second, why that's the case, because it might sound odd to say that the liar cares about the truth, but we'll see that there's some plausibility to Frankfurt's point. And finally, another difference is, as we said a few times, the bullshitter's goal is to misrepresent himself, right? To make it look like he knows something that he doesn't, to make it look like he has some qualities that he doesn't actually have. Whereas the liar is trying to misrepresent the truth itself, right? So, for example, somebody stole money from you. They want you to believe that somebody else stole it. They really, really care about getting you to believe that particular falsehood, that somebody else stole it. Whereas the bullshitter doesn't really care about specifics. They care about the general sense of how they're perceived. So before we get into some of these open questions that we might have about bullshitting and lying, I mentioned that there's a sense in which the liar really does care about the truth. And that in particular is because they want the people they're trying to deceive to believe something specific. So again, in our example, if you stole the money from someone and you want to lie to them, your goal is to try and get them not to suspect you, but to suspect somebody else, right? So you very, very much care about the truth because you don't want them to know that truth in that case. Some open questions we might have. Are we more tolerant of bullshit than lying in society? And if so, why? So again, you might think, yes, right? Examples like the associate dean, we're used to that kind of stuff. We expect it. If the dean didn't give this effusive praise to their new hire, it would be seen as odd, maybe rude, right? Something strange is going on. People would start to read into it. We, in many ways, are kind of comfortable with bullshitting, right? It's so common. So if somebody bullshits you trying to sell you a product, right, you don't maybe like it that much, but you're probably not going to be as offended as if that same person told you a specific lie that you caught them in. So we might ask, well, why is that? And does that ultimately make sense? Secondly, is the practice of bullshitting always a bad thing? It sounds like it could be bad, right? You might say we should care about the truth, and bullshit is all about misrepresentation, so that seems contrary to the truth. But again, back to Nietzsche's question, why do we value truth over untruth in all cases? And should we value it over untruth in all cases? Maybe, right? People like Socrates would seem to say yes, but most human beings don't live their lives that way, and that might indicate that there are some cases in which we think perhaps untruth is a good thing, and maybe in particular bullshit is sometimes called for. And finally, could we have a community without bullshit of any kind? Right? So imagine people never misrepresented themselves. They were just honest. They cared about the truth and tried to represent it and themselves in an honest, sincere light. What would that kind of world look like, and would it even work? You might imagine that that would be possibly an unfriendly place. Think of a very common example of bullshit. Somebody that you don't know that well ask you how your day's going. It's a terrible day, but we all know that you're supposed to say, oh yeah, I'm okay, how are you? And that's an example of bullshit, right? Because we're going to say, yes, I'm fine, or something like it, regardless of whether it's true or not. And in that sense, we don't care about that specific truth in that context. And you might ask, is that such a bad thing? Does that really matter? Does it do any harm? Maybe not, but that is an open question, something that we could debate. So back to Nietzsche's question, why value truth in the first place? Well, the first thing we might point out is that in some cases, people do prefer untruth to truth. So think about fans at sporting events, right, where they reject the calls of the referee that are against their team, right? They're sure that those calls are false. They hate them, right? They boo. They would do that regardless of whether it was a good call or not, right? Often, at least some fans, right? They just want the officiating to go in a way that is beneficial to their team. Whether it's a good call or not is much less important, for some people at least, than that the call be beneficial for the team that they want to win. So that's an example where we're placing some other value, right, winning, above the value of the truth. It seems clear that humans do that, right? Or in politics, right? We often don't want to face unpleasant truths, so we believe happy messages, or at least pretend to believe them, right? We vote for people that may not turn out to be the best choice for us, but many of us don't seem to be that interested in digging deeper and trying to find the truth. Or think about self-image. Many people have inaccurate ideas of their own abilities and their own characteristics. Some people overly positive, and some people overly negative. So why do we do that? And is it a good thing or a bad thing to do that? And if so, when is it good or when is it bad? Those are all interesting questions, but it seems hard to deny that we are often simply just wrong about who we are. And perhaps facing the truth in some cases would be very unpleasant, or possibly even harmful in a deeper way. So, okay, what is the value of truth? Is there ever a good reason to prefer untruth to truth? Well, possibly, right? If untruth makes you happier, you might ask, what's more important than happiness? If I believe what's true, and the truth is something terrible and depressing, then what good has that actually done for me? Would I just be happier believing some sort of untruth or not thinking about the matter very much? And would my life be better if I did that? Possibly, right? And again, that's an open question, but it gives some plausibility to Nietzsche's sort of questioning of whether truth is always the thing that we should care about. Okay, so let's take a look then at this idea of doubt mongering from Oreskes and Conway. So their idea, and they use the term merchants of doubt, is that some people sell unreasonable doubt to the public. Their examples are tobacco companies in the past, and in more recent times, climate change denial. So this can come in various forms. The idea of selling doubt is that you are trying to get people to doubt something, to be uncertain. The goal isn't to get some people to believe something in particular. So for example, contrast getting people to doubt whether climate change is real versus getting people to believe that climate change is a hoax. Those are two different things. And you might ask, well, why would anyone want to sell doubt rather than just selling an outright lie? And the reason is sometimes that it's hard to get people to believe the outright lie, but it is much easier in those cases to get people to believe that there's uncertainty or room for doubt about something. So this came out when some of the tobacco companies were being sued some decades ago for harming the public health. And there was a memo from one company called Brown and Williamson that came out in the court discovery process. And there was a very interesting claim that some executive had made in one of the meetings, which is that doubt is our product. And the background of that was that they said it's very clear from the science that smoking in particular is bad for your health, causes lung cancer and other problems, and that there was just no way that the tobacco companies could reasonably contest that, right? They couldn't have a public campaign, a marketing campaign in which they said, oh, actually smoking is good for you, because it was just too obvious of a lie, right? Not, at least they thought, not many people would buy that and it wouldn't be very effective. Whereas if you could just create doubt in people's minds, that seemed much more reasonable, and that left more room for people to sort of rationalize continuing to buy tobacco products. So for example, if you go into the store, it's like, should I buy cigarettes today? And it's like, well, I know that these are going to kill me eventually, most likely. That's a pretty big obstacle. You might still buy them, but that's a pretty big obstacle to going through with the purchase. But if you're not sure, and you think in your mind, well, some people think it's bad for your health, others say it's fine, we don't really know, so I'm going to roll the dice and I'm still going to buy the product and I'm going to smoke this, and there's a good chance I'll be fine, right? I won't get sick. That's much easier to sort of convince yourself of and to go ahead with the purchase. Now, the problem is, not that doubt is a bad thing. Sometimes we just don't know things, and it is reasonable to have doubts. But when there are cases where the truth is clear, right, where, say, the science is overwhelming that smoking is bad for your health, there's not room for reasonable doubt in that case. But if some people sell it to you, right, some people say there's a campaign to try and convince you that, well, scientists aren't really sure, there's both sides to this debate, maybe it's okay for you, maybe not, we don't really know. If that's not true, then you are being misled, right? And that, in fact, is what the tobacco companies did for a long time, for a while, is that they sort of misrepresented the state of the science and said, hey, we don't know, maybe tobacco isn't so bad. So you can go on and keep buying it, and maybe in the future we'll have more information. But for now, you don't have much reason to change your habits if you're already a smoker. That wasn't true, right? The science was pretty clear, just about almost a complete near consensus among the experts. Yeah, this is bad for your health. But if you don't know that and you fall prey to the unreasonable doubt that's being sold to you, that can severely impact your choices, right? What you do, what you believe. So Oreskes and Conway think that we see this in various contexts, more recently with climate change. So an overwhelming, vast, almost 100% of trained experts on the science of climate change agree, yes, it's a real phenomenon, yes, it's human caused, and yes, it will have negative impacts for human and non-human systems in the future. Right? That's pretty well established. There's not much room to reject that, but if you're a bad actor, you can sort of inject some confusion into that. You can mislead the public into thinking, well, the scientists aren't really sure. Some people say climate change is real, some say it isn't. That isn't an accurate representation of what the experts really think, but unless you yourself have delved into all of the expert research, you might not know that. And if there are figures in the media who are telling you that we don't really know if climate change is real, you might just say, well, yeah, they don't know, right? We perhaps shouldn't invest any resources into fighting climate change if we don't even know if it's a real problem yet. So let's leave more time for research. That sounds very reasonable, and that is part of what Oreskes and Conway think is so nefarious about this practice, is that it preys on people's open-mindedness, that people are open to doubting things, and oftentimes that's a rational thing to do, but that's taken advantage of, and sort of this inaccurate representation of expert opinion is pushed on the public so that many people end up confused and think that, well, scientists don't really know what the truth is, when in fact the scientists do have a consensus on, for example, climate change more recently, and going back a bit on the dangers of using tobacco products. So what is a merchant of doubt in particular? So somebody who actually is in the business of selling unreasonable doubt to the public. Well, as Oreskes and Conway understand it, a merchant of doubt is someone who knows, or at least believes, that the evidence supports a certain position, but the merchant of doubt still tries to get others to doubt that position. So, for example, if I know that, the scientists are almost in complete consensus that climate change is human-caused, but I nonetheless try and create doubts in people's minds about that, I'm engaged in a kind of dishonest practice where I know what I'm doing is misleading, but I do it anyway, right? So a merchant of doubt isn't somebody who, back to our earlier distinction between mistaken belief and lying, a merchant of doubt isn't just someone who has a false belief, despite their best efforts, but it's rather somebody who believes the truth or thinks that they believe or know the truth, but nonetheless tries to create doubts in the minds of the public or of other people. So a couple of examples here that we've talked about already, but the notion of selling unreasonable doubt, so being a merchant of doubt, is that it involves deceit of some kind, right? So for example, lying about the scientific consensus, but the aim is to create doubt rather than asserting the opposite position. So again, the difference between saying, who knows if smoking is unhealthy, versus telling the lie that smoking is good for you. It's going to be hard to get people to believe the second claim, but that first one, you're going to have an easier time with. Maybe nowadays, not so much with smoking, but with whatever the newer issues are, right? That say this product causes cancer or something like that. Let's say the science is 100% clear. Yeah, it does. But you are in the business of selling that product. You might hire a marketing team to create doubts in the minds of the public and say, well, the scientists don't really know. We need more research. Give us more time. Don't pass regulation, that kind of stuff. So some open questions about this merchant of doubt phenomenon. So is selling unreasonable doubt ever justified in an ethical sense or otherwise? Secondly, how can we tell the difference between reasonable and unreasonable doubt? And that's a pretty tough one, right? We don't want to pretend that we know everything because there's a lot of stuff that, of course, we don't know. So we should be doubtful in some cases, right? Somebody says A is the case. Somebody else says A is not the case. I don't know who to believe. I can't assess the evidence myself because I'm not an expert or I don't have access to it. In a case like that, it just seems reasonable to say, well, I don't know. I have my doubts. I don't accept either position because I just don't know enough. But it's precisely that open-mindedness that I mentioned before that Oreskes and Conway think that the merchants of doubt can prey upon. So what do we do about that, right, when it comes to educating the public and trying to think clearly for ourselves, distinguishing between when doubt is reasonable and when it's not? And third, how should society respond to this merchants of doubt problem? You can imagine lots of responses, from passing laws of certain kind to outlaw the practice, although trying to enforce that and identify exactly when it's happening wouldn't be so easy. You could imagine education campaigns to try and get people better equipped to be ready for this when it arises in various contexts. But again, because selling doubt isn't so much selling an outright lie as it is just creating confusion among people, it seems like it's harder to combat than straight out disinformation. Okay, so that's all for this time. So we covered bullshit from Frankfurt's perspective and the idea of selling unreasonable doubt from the perspective of Oreskes and Conway. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.